Good evening. Welcome to BackStory with Joan Goldstein. I'm Joan Goldstein. Our topic for tonight is Occupy Wall Street, but not simply Occupy Wall Street, but what is the backstory and what is the ongoing story as a result. My guest tonight is an independent filmmaker, Dan Preston, who himself went down to Wall Street to film some of the events that occurred on the Brooklyn Bridge October 1.
That's right.
Right. Hi, Dan. This is kind of an exciting story, isn't it? I mean,
It's very exciting. I mean, not my participation in it, which was simply being there on one day, but the growing movement that I guess is now about 6-7 weeks old now, and has changed the nature of the national debate about jobs and inequality, and taken it away from false debates over deficits, and so it is a very exciting time.
right. This is a statement that was made by Occupy Wall Street. That was a flyer they handed out that someone in New York sent me. They say, the background: on September 17th, 2011, people from all across the United States of America and the world came to protest the blatant injustices perpetuated by the 1%, the economic and political elites whose actions affect all of us, the 99%. We spoke out, resisted, and successfully occupied Wall Street. Today, we proudly remain engaged in nonviolent civil disobedience while building solidarity based on mutual respect, acceptance, and love. Okay, what happened when you went in on October 1st to the Brooklyn Bridge? We're going to show some of those of that film today, and I watched it and I thought there were two very strong veins that went in there. One was very idealistic. There's the fellow with the guitar singing "Blowing in the Wind," and all of us who remember the peace movement, and brings back memories. And there's a sense of people being happy and joyful about being together. And then the second one is very dark as the police move in and basically seem to entrap the marchers and then begin to arrest people. And now it takes a very dark turn and a very ominous feel to it. What was your thinking? What was your observations when you were doing this?
Well, I think that is an interesting contrast of
Yeah.
both the bright side of the movement itself. I think the dark side is the problems that the movement is seeking to confront. On October 1st, the Occupy Wall Street was really only about 2 weeks old. They started on September 17th. A week later, I think, is when many people became first aware of it. That's when I think it was 4 young women were pepper sprayed by the New York City police in a manner that seemed unprovoked, and that video went viral and people really started paying attention, and that includes me and my wife. And so the next Saturday, October 1st, we just decided to go in. We really didn't know what the plan was for that day. As it turned out, it was a march from Zuccotti Park to the Brooklyn Bridge was the plan for the afternoon. So we got there in time for that to march from the park up to the bridge. And the feeling really was joyful in terms of people, many of whom had never seen each other before, marching shoulder to shoulder and expressing a feeling of being together as the 99%. The hints of darkness were that some people were writing on their arms the phone number of the Lawyers Guild, and
Anticipating that they would need a lawyer?
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean, I think there were some anticipating that they may face arrest, and then actually when we got to the entrance of the bridge itself, the crowd kind of divided. Some went on the roadway across the bridge, and there were by the time I got there, there was no obstruction to doing that. The crowd was just flowing up onto the bridge. And then the other half of the crowd, which my wife and I decided to join, was up on the pedestrian walkway, which kind of looks down on the roadway. I had my video camera with me, and I thought that might be a better vantage point. There was a hint, but no official word, that if you were on the roadway, you probably faced greater chance of arrest than if you were up on the platform. And since I make my living with my camera, I didn't want to risk that part either. So sure enough, as we proceeded across the bridge, things were just flowing. And then at the midway point, there was a police barricade midway across the roadway, and people got trapped there. And then police were following up on the roadway, blocking any retreat from the people who had entered the roadway. And from that point forward, they started arresting people. Mm-hmm. And I think ultimately about 700 people were arrested. Whoa. While those of us up on the platform, on the pedestrian walkway, observed, and many of us filmed what was going on. And that was mm-hmm. the footage that then I posted on YouTube.
Mm-hmm. Let's watch some of it now, okay?
Let's go, come on, you in the thing. What's wrong? They're going to start putting, maybe they'll start opening up this concentration. What verse you on?
My friends, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind. How many how many years can some people exist before they're allowed to be free? Yes, and how many can a man turn his head? How many times can a man turn his head and pretend that he just doesn't see? The answer, my friends, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing in the wind.
Okay, so you know, this kind of dark scene there, where they're basically entrapping people with those orange nets. And suddenly the whole tone turns dark and very frightening. And here are people saying, well, we're peaceful marchers and we're non-violent people. And it kind of brings back memories of other social movements of nonviolence, and nevertheless they were met with violence as well. As the month moves on into October 15th, two young high school men living here in the Princeton area went into Times Square. They wanted to see what was going on. They wanted to take some pictures also. And they gave me their observations, which is now, we're looking at not Zuccotti Park so much as Times Square and Washington Square. So here he writes, first the protesters created a micro-society in Zuccotti Park, renamed Liberty Park by the protesters. There were small, quote, neighborhoods for sleeping, food, medical attention, sign painting, cleaning, and even a library and a teach-in space. On the first day of the protest, none of this had been set up yet. It was literally just an open space with some flowers and stone sitting areas filled with a little over 1,000 people and surrounded by street vendors. Now I would liken the park to a kind of college dormitory that has its own kitchen and library just outside and quite a bit smaller. Despite the small space, movement is pretty easy, especially on days other than the ones filled with events. Saturday, October 15th, was the global day of action, so there were far more people in the park than usual. He says his friend Julian and I demonstrated together in the march to Chase Bank at 11 a.m. We followed a pace setter, someone who knew the route and had basic training in how to keep groups together. In parenthesis, if we slowed down or separated, the police would start arresting us. So here again you have this, the threat, the kind of shadowing or foreshadowing of the police and arrests going on. The energy of the crowd, he says, was infectious. When I chanted, "We're the 99%," and banks got bailed out, we got sold out. I felt like the small group immediately around me who was synchronized in our chant. The people up in front and back were not always chanting the same thing at the same time. Was a solid group, people I knew and could rely on, even though I hadn't talked to any of them before. So that was that sense of community, that sense of togetherness that they found. He also joins a group called the Black and Red Cross, and these are called medics who were going around to the different sites to help people who were exposed to tear gas. And so there was also this medical concern, this physical concern about the use of tear gas. And then they formed their help groups to see if they could help people who were exposed to tear gas. He says, one thing, and this is maybe a 17-year-old, 16-year-old, one thing I think you'd find interesting, he's saying to me, as a sociologist, is the collective disgust at the images we saw on the neon advertising on the square. This is in Times Square. So he's contrasting what's up there in the Times Square and what's going on down there on the street. This was a very smart young man. So he took pictures. They went to Zuccotti Park and they took pictures, and he said, I had a great conversation with one guy who felt outraged about Bloomberg having a third term and using aggressive marketing techniques to get his campaign message to voters. This was one I hadn't heard yet. As a New Jerseyan, I had no idea about New York politics, and no one else in the protest had taken this particular edge. But if we're talking about abuses of money in politics, Bloomberg is as good a place to start as any. So they began to identify for themselves who they thought were some of the more villainous characters in the scenario. And I guess this is probably what's going on at this moment. Now, we get to the end of October, and there was this very troubling events out in Oakland, California, right? And again, the police become more aggressive, they become more violent towards these marchers. And the general public, too, many people didn't understand what they were doing. I mean, you would hear people say, yeah, my friend went into New York and he went up to the protesters and they said, why don't you go get a job? You know, as if this was an alternative to having a job. So a lot of people, I think, didn't understand what they were doing, and also I think the press didn't always cover it as thoroughly as possible. They tended to trivialize it. They tried to make it look more like it was Woodstock all over again, looking for the more outrageous outfits or the more bizarre looking people to pick off and show and say, this is just a bunch of crazy people. But they weren't, were they? Because afterwards, when the election came up in early November, things changed, didn't they?
Well, yes. I mean, and it's unclear, I think, whether the results on Election Day, November 8th, derived directly from Occupy Wall Street. But I think there is, both Occupy and some of the election results are a reaction to the swing to the right that we saw in 2010 with the Tea Party ascendant and the many right-wing Republicans elected not just to the U.S. Congress but in state houses across the country. But the Occupy movement initially got, I think, criticized unfairly and mischaracterized because it's not what the press or most of our society is used to dealing with, which is a true grassroots, leaderless organization. It has a whole new way of self-organizing, and it's not about appointing leaders, but it's actually about building consensus and with a sense of togetherness and not the hyper-individualism that our society seems to reward and sometimes to excess. I think there's a lot of concern about some of the participants about being co-opted by whether it's the Democratic Party leadership that for good reason they don't necessarily trust.
You're right on target here, actually, because what was interesting in the election is I noticed that the New York Times did an interesting op-ed piece. They said back to common sense at the polls. And what they point out is that some of the more extreme measures were voted out. For example, many voters are tired of legislation driven by ideology, more ideology than practicality, of measures that impoverish the middle class or deprive people of basic rights in order to prove some discredited economic theory or cultural belief. The most evident, they say, was in Ohio, where voters overwhelmingly repealed a law pushed through last spring by Republicans to shred collective bargaining rights for public employees. It prohibited bargaining on health benefits for states and local workers, including teachers, police officers, firefighters, and it made it much harder to collect union dues or negotiate on staffing. So this was killed, and this was, in a sense, we have to think that maybe this kind of reconsideration of the voters is getting a better sense of what the problems are. Maybe Occupy Wall Street, even though not best presented in the press, at least they began to get a sense of what people should be paying attention to, what they might be concerned about, with a greater we say consciousness raising in the women's movement. Mm-hmm. A greater consciousness raising maybe was the result. And there were several other situations, something in Mississippi and another one in other states where they were going to do things which would have been considered more repressive.
Well, I think, well, I mean, organized labor actually deserves a lot of credit for showing the way that I think helped lead to Occupy Wall Street. What started in Wisconsin in the winter almost a year ago, the demonstrations in Madison, which persisted day after day after day. I mean, that was something I think that was relatively new. We're used to giant anti-war marches or marches against poverty, but that typically last a day, and the press can ignore them, and then it vanishes as if nothing happens.
Right.
When people sustain an effort day after day, week after week, as they did in Madison, the press was forced to pay attention, and that movement built, and it was not just unions. It then brought in many supporters, students and other middle class people, and I mean, so that was one source of inspiration already. Then of course, the Arab Spring was another truly amazing people's movement that that showed what the power of just regular people gathering together in a sustained way can do.
And also met with violence too. Nonviolent met with violence. You know?
That's true, but it shows the power of nonviolence, and so I think the Occupy movement took inspiration from both of those, and I think now it's been reinforcing. I think one of the pivotal moments in the Occupy movement was when organized labor very much decided to join in, and that's actually one of the interesting contrasts with perhaps the anti-war movement of the 1960s, that many people in labor were pretty skeptical about what seemed to be a bunch of hippies protesting the war, and in fact we had the famous clash between the hard hats and protesters in whatever year that was, 1970 more or less, where so the hard hats were battling the anti-war protesters on Wall Street. Today it's very different. It's a movement that invites people across the spectrum, whether you're a student or a laborer, whether you're homeless or actually quite comfortable, but concerned about what's happening to the country, and I think that's one of the real powers. I mean, it really is the 99% that
so that's very interesting, a new turn in the road. Also, I think today's paper, or yesterday's paper, the Teamsters Union is not only supporting them, but learning from the Occupy. They're becoming more assertive in the way that they're demonstrating, and they've also donated food to the protesters. They've donated food, and they're encouraging them. So suddenly you're getting this widening of the circle rather than combative groups against each other. The circle is widening.
Well, and one potential addition to that circle may be the police themselves. I'm not sure that we've seen a whole lot of that, although I think there have been some communities where the police have been reluctant to push against the demonstrators, because the police, after all, are part of the 99%, and their unions are under attack, their jobs are under threat, their benefits are being pared down, and their interests are very much in common with the people on the other side of the barricades. You know, we'll hope that that common interest will be understood, at least to the point of preventing any escalation of violence, you know, that we've seen happen in some cases, as in Oakland when the Iraq War vet got very badly injured by either a tear gas canister or a rubber bullet or something, and then the people that went to help him were then bombed by something thrown by a flash grenade thrown by a police officer. I'm really hoping that proves to be the exception. We'll see.
Also, there are other things going on that are not connected to it. For example, I went to something on Sunday put together by a group I think called Move On, and they had Paul Krugman speaking, and they had a man named Larry Ham from Newark, and there is a group in Newark who are protesting the unemployment, and they started even before. They started June 27th, even before the Occupy Wall Street group, and they're right downtown in Newark, and they're out there, and he reports increases in poverty in a city like Newark. He reported being outside a McDonald's, and that people are standing outside there begging the customers who come out for food, or not necessarily for themselves but for their children. He's showing that there's an increase in poverty in an area already trying to deal with poverty, and that it's creating an awareness that we need to do something about jobs and about employment, and that these are the kinds of focus we need. So I did an experiment with my college social students, and asked them if any of them wanted to run for public office. And although they don't vote, it seems they don't vote. But this got them interested in voting, I think. So a few of them got up and they were supposed to make a little speech about what they would do. And although some of them sounded like really good goals, when others in the class asked them, how are you going to do this, they just, said, I guess it's harder than we thought, which of course I wanted them to understand. He said, I guess it's harder than we thought, how to make these changes. Because while some people are losing, other people are benefiting. So as long as some are benefiting, they're going to fight more to keep things the way they are.
Well, that's the vast middle. I mean, I think that's where the Occupy movement versus the Tea Party movement contrast. I mean, I think some of the motivation comes from the same place, the sense of people being in precarious positions. I think the Tea Party right-wing approach is basically to blame the less advantaged for somehow bringing the system down and for somehow weakening the so-called productive aspects of society. So it's really sort of a blame the victim, blame the powerless approach, and as long as you haven't slipped into those ranks, latching on to the 1% and the promises coming from those in power, that's one approach. I think the Occupy movement is a much more sympathetic to those who are disadvantaged and are focusing on where the actual power in our society lies, which is the 1% or even the 1/10 of 1%, so it's blaming, I think correctly, the people who are actually running things and who have been benefiting enormously from how society operates, and I think that will be, an interesting social change that to look for again, to see where the disaffected middle really goes, whether they continue to take the Tea Party route and go more toward a dog eat dog Darwinian culture where it's everyone out for themselves versus a more we're all in it together, and that we need some kind of balance, and the fact that the 99% really should be, should have 99% of the political power, because it should be one person, one vote, versus a system right now where it seems more like $1, one vote, and those who have all the money seem to have all the political power at the moment.
Yeah, attributed to the high cost of running for public office for one thing, but not entirely altogether. Well, I think we're living in interesting times. As the old Chinese proverb was, you should live in interesting times, which is a double-edged statement, because they're meaning that these interesting times can be very difficult times as well. And you've put your finger on it. It's about social change. And social change is always difficult and disruptive. And we don't know where anything's going. We don't know where it's heading. Where will we be a year from now? I think some people are hoping, who don't like the movement, the Occupy Wall Street movement, that the winter will come. They're waiting for, quick, give us a snowstorm, get these people out of the park and freeze them out. But I don't think that's going to happen. Somehow or other, Mother Nature started out with a snowstorm, but it seems it's getting pleasant again to sleep outdoors. And more important, they're very determined. They're not going to go away. They'll take it to a next level. And as you also point out, they don't want to fall into the business of being co-opted, which was always an issue with I think, the peace movement as well. Somebody who wants to be a celebrity, who wants to get on the stage and be a celebrity and take the group in the direction that it doesn't really believe in or want to go in. What my students would say, and rightly so, charismatic leaders. Charismatic leaders take on the mood of the crowd and move them in directions that can be quite destructive. So they understand that. They understand that very well, and this is why they don't want, this is why they want to be leaderless. This is also why they're working in committees, which is longer and more torturous, but nevertheless is a better safeguard against the creation of charismatic and perhaps destructive leaders. So we don't know where it's going, but we know change is upon us. And that's probably one of the more exciting things about living in this interesting time. Thank you very much, Dan Preston, for your wonderful thoughts and your good work in this community.
Thanks for having me.
And
Tim.
let's do it again in a couple of months or so and see where things are. Let's keep following this story along, shall we?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you for coming to BackStory with Joan Goldstein. Good night.